make a start, inshallah?
Yes, I've started.
Oh, you've
Thank you.
started. Okay, yeah, just had a look at that. Okay, alhamdulillah. Right, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. Rabbi zidni ilma, Rabbi zidni ilma, Rabbi zidni ilma. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. And jazakallah khair for attending. Unfortunately, actually, the very last session of the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's been a really interesting series, mashallah. And today we're going to be talking about two more very important Sahabas. But today would be the last session that we run this series, inshallah. But before we get into the story of these two absolutely amazing companions, let me just give you a small background about who I am. My name is Summer, and I'm an associate member of UK Islamic Mission from the East London branch. And what else can I say about myself? It's quite hard when you've been put on the spot like this. I'm a maths teacher, secondary school maths teacher by profession, and alhamdulillah, I've been a volunteer as well for a number of years now at UKM. Other than that, alhamdulillah, I have a 1 year old who is increasingly keeping me busy, although it's my half term. And yeah, alhamdulillah, I live in London. I feel like I'm just saying bits and bits and bits now, but inshallah, I think let's get on with it and let's make a start so that we have as much time as possible to discuss these two very amazing Sahabas, inshallah. So, the first Sahaba that we're going to be talking about is Abdullah ibn Abbas. Now, Abdullah ibn Abbas, he was known as a scholar of the nation. And it's quite remarkable about his passion for knowledge and the way he went about to search for education and search for answers. And there's a lot of lessons actually that we can learn from Abdullah ibn Abbas. So let's start with Abdullah ibn Abbas in his early childhood. So in his early childhood, he was born in Islam. So essentially, he was born after the Prophet ﷺ's first revelation. So he was essentially born as, you could say, a Muslim, right? He didn't have to convert. He was born in a Muslim family. And actually, he was born 3 years before the migration. So 3 years before the Hijrah, he was born then. The Prophet ﷺ actually did his tahniq. And for those who may not understand what tahniq is, let me explain. So when a baby is born, what the Prophet ﷺ used to do was that he would chew a date, and the flavor of the date mixed with his saliva, the Prophet ﷺ would take that from his own mouth and place it in the baby's mouth. And that is known to be full of, we know dates are iron rich, and obviously they're sweet as well. So that was a sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and we should also continue doing that sunnah as well. There's nothing wrong in doing that. So he would take, let me repeat that, he would take a date, he would chew the date, mix it with the saliva, a very little bit. It was obviously babies can't swallow solids, but just a very little bit mixed in the saliva just for that taste to come through. He would then put it in the baby's mouth. So the Prophet ﷺ actually practiced this. He did this on Abdullah ibn Abbas. So Abdullah ibn Abbas was also the cousin of the Prophet ﷺ, and he spent a lot of time with the Prophet ﷺ as well. There are narrations of Abdullah ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu playing with the Prophet ﷺ, where the Prophet ﷺ is putting him on his shoulders, and a bit like if you have an older cousin that you aspire towards and you always want to be like, this is kind of who the Prophet ﷺ was to Abdullah ibn Abbas. So for instance, when my son goes to see his cousins who are almost 10 years older than him, he's obsessed. It's like, I want to be like him, I want to do everything that my cousin does. He's running around, my son is running around with, his older cousins and just really looking up to them and copying everything. And that's what Abdullah ibn Abbas was to the Prophet ﷺ. I mean, think about the age gap. So, the age gap between them is obviously quite vast. At least it must be like, the Prophet ﷺ received revelation when he was, in his 20s. And so you think about, sorry, not in his 20s. Oh my gosh, I've just gone blank. When did the Prophet ﷺ receive his revelation, the first revelation? Do you guys want to help me here? Because I've literally just gone blank. What age was the Prophet ﷺ when he received the first revelation?
40 years old.
40 years, right? Old. Thank you. I was in my head, I'm like, 23 or 40? I'm getting so confused. 40 years old. So the age gap is at least 40 years old between these two people, right? Jazakallah khair for that. So the Prophet ﷺ is, there's a story which actually sets this whole thing up. It sets the search for Abdullah ibn Abbas's uh, passion for education. So Abdullah ibn Abbas was once sat on the Prophet ﷺ's shoulder, and he was, playing, and as you do, you put someone on your shoulder and you're playing with them, running around with them. And the Prophet ﷺ made this dua. He said, "Oh Allah, give this child a deep understanding of the deen and grant him knowledge of the interpretation of the religion." So, this dua was answered later in Abdullah ibn Abbas's life, and he was known as the jurist of the Ummah, essentially the one with the most knowledge about jurisprudence, about fiqh, right? About the really, nitty-gritty details about the interpretations of the rulings of Islam. And he was also given the deepest knowledge of the Quran as well. Now, he was a child who grew up to become this. And from this we learn not to underestimate the power of dua, especially of those who are pious amongst us. Abdullah ibn Abbas, he's a child at this point where the Prophet ﷺ is making this dua for him. And the dua is answered obviously much later in Abdullah ibn Abbas's life. But the most powerful dua is the one made in secret without the recipient knowing. And obviously this was a dua that was made in secret by the Prophet ﷺ. And Abdullah ibn Abbas didn't understand at that young age what perhaps the deep understanding of the deen is, or what the interpretation of the revelation is. But the Prophet ﷺ's prayer is answered. Another dua that the Prophet ﷺ made was, there was a time when Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu was standing behind the Prophet ﷺ in Salah. And again, he was a young boy at this point. And the Prophet ﷺ in mid-Salah pulled him to stand next to him. But Ibn Abbas, he went back to where he stood, so he stood behind. So when the Salah finished, the Prophet ﷺ asked Ibn Abbas, "Oh, Ibn Abbas, why did you move back? Like, I told you to come, I pulled you in Salah to come to the front, in my line. Why did you move back?" And Ibn Abbas said, "I have so much respect for you and so much admiration for you. How can I stand in the same line as you?" And upon hearing this, the Prophet ﷺ made a dua for him. And he said, "Oh Allah, grant this child wisdom." And from this, we will see in a moment as well that Ibn Abbas became such a wise young man that even Muslims used to refer to him as a very wise child. So in his late teens, like when we go to somebody who's elder to us, especially like our grandparents, and we seek their wisdom, often you have, sometimes in our head, we have this image of a really wise old man. So this is what Ibn Abbas was as a child. He was very mature, very, this sort of picture that you have of an old wise man in your head, very sort of, calm and collected and very thoughtful and very mature. That's what Ibn Abbas was, even in his, in his teens, in his youth. So Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu, as he was growing up, he had a huge passion for questioning. He would just question everything. And he used to listen very carefully to the discussions of the Sahaba. And he was actually once asked, "Where did you get all this knowledge from?" And he replied with, "I ask a lot of questions." And often when we look at our own lives, we find our young kids, and of course, I understand with children, it does get a bit annoying. But when our children start asking questions like why and how, we shouldn't dismiss those questions, as difficult as it may seem, because this is how they are developing their bank of knowledge, right? And asking questions, I mean, as a teacher, I always tell my pupils that there is no such thing as a silly question, because there isn't, because it shows and it demonstrates that they are keen to learn, that they are keen to understand the subject matter, or what is being taught to them. So from, Ibn Abbas, from this personality trait of his, we learn that asking questions actually deepens the knowledge, even at such a young age. So when the Prophet ﷺ passed away, all the Sahaba immediately returned back from their travels. Okay, so this is another story that I'm telling you. It's a really good one, actually. And so the Sahaba, after the Prophet during the Prophet while he was alive, obviously the Sahaba used to go to nearby areas in Africa and Asia to preach the message of Islam. So a lot of them were on missions, they were traveling. So when the Prophet died, all the Sahaba immediately returned back into Medina, obviously because the Prophet had passed away. And Ibn Abbas said to his friends, said to his one friend, actually, come on, let's go now and ask the companions of the Prophet, all the questions that we want answered. Let's go, because he understood that in this one area, there are so many people with so much knowledge, the companions. So he wanted to utilize this opportunity. So Ibn Abbas at this point was only about 13. And the friend of Ibn Abbas replied, look, they're not going to have time for us. They've come from a long way after their travels, discussing about the aftermath of the Prophet ﷺ's death. They're not going to have time for us. Look, let's leave them. Why don't we play with the pigeons instead? Now, back in the day, instead of Xbox and PS3s and etc., they used to play with pigeons, okay? So that's why he's referring to, let's play with the pigeons instead. So Ibn Abbas realized that, he doesn't want to be on this, he doesn't want to come with me. Let's leave him. So Ibn Abbas left this friend and approached the houses of the companions. And what he did was he took off his cloak and placed it at their doorstep. And he would go to sleep at this doorstep. The dust is all over him, just to wait for one of the companions to come outside so that he can ask them his questions. Now, when the companions opened the door to find Ibn Abbas sleeping, right, they immediately said, look, why, Ibn Abbas, like, we would come to you, O cousin of the Prophet ﷺ, just tell us. You don't need to subject yourself to this sort of humiliation. And Ibn Abbas at this point replied with a statement very, very profound. And he said, knowledge is sought. Knowledge doesn't come to you, you have to go to it. Basically meaning that if you want to find out something, you need to put in the effort to go and find that thing out. You don't just sit there and expect things to come at you. Okay? So in the same incident, Zayd ibn Thabit is another companion of the Prophet ﷺ, and he's about 8 years older than Ibn Abbas. Okay, so if Ibn Abbas is 13, Zayd ibn Thabit is like in his 20s, right? He's like 21. He's not very old at all, okay? And Abdullah ibn Abbas sees him coming on his camel, and he takes the reins of the camel and starts to serve Zayd ibn Thabit. And Zayd ibn Thabit immediately says, oh, cousin of the Prophet ﷺ, you don't need to do this. Like, why are you taking the reins of my camel? Why are you serving me like this? And Ibn Abbas then said this. He said, this is how we were commanded to treat our elders and our scholars. Then Zayd ibn Thabit took the hands of Ibn Abbas and kissed them and said, this is how we were commanded to treat the family of the Prophet ﷺ. And both of these quotes of Ibn Abbas are so profound. Both of these stories are so profound, because the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, they understand the value of knowledge and the value of humility. In neither story did the companions say, oh yes, we are closer to the Prophet ﷺ, so yes, you should be doing this, you should be subjecting yourself to this sort of humiliation. They didn't. Ibn Abbas understood the value of knowledge, and he understood the value of those that were giving him this knowledge, his teachers, his scholars. So nowadays we see that when we've got young people, and this is quite helpful because I'm a teacher, but you see a lot of disrespect in some cases from pupils to their teachers. And we as Muslims, we are taught that no, we are to treat our elders and our scholars with respect. Knowledge is not just something that comes to you. It is something that is extremely, extremely valuable. So Ibn Abbas later in life as well, this is another quote of his, and he said, I was humble as a student, and that's why I was respected as a teacher. And, as Abdullah ibn Abbas grew up, and, he was obviously, Allah accepted the dua of the Prophet ﷺ, he started preaching Islam, but also he had such a deep understanding of Islam. He was doing a lot of classes and things like this. But what's really interesting is that, remember that friend that we spoke about back on this slide? Where is it? Oh no, I was telling you about it in the story where his friend, he just left his friend was saying, oh yeah, let's go play with the pigeons. Now what became of him? Now, when Ibn Abbas became famous, by famous I mean like he became well known for his knowledge, the friend would often look at Ibn Abbas and say, that young man knew better than me, he was smarter than I was. Right? So, what does that teach us about our company when it comes to education and when it comes to knowledge? That when we see someone that it may not be a good influence for us in our search, in our aims, in our goals, it is better that you seek it yourself rather than being influenced by your friends. Okay, so in this particular case, it was easy for Ibn Abbas to say, yeah, okay, fine. The companions are too, they're not going to give me time. I'll just go and play with the pigeons. Fine, I'll come with you. And it's really easy because his friend, there was almost this element of peer pressure there, right? His friend was saying, no, what are they going to do? They're not going to listen to you. Let's just go and play. But Ibn Abbas didn't give in to that. He understood the value of knowledge, and he understand that, no, I want this, so I'm going to find my way to get it. As Ibn Abbas, as I was mentioning earlier, that as he was growing up, he was about middle-aged, and he would hold, again, he's not very old, he's middle-aged, he's in his 20s, in his 30s, and he would hold gatherings every day, and he would teach people actual subjects. So, for instance, he would have tafsir. Remember, he had a deepened understanding of the Quran, jurisprudence, he had knowledge of fiqh, history. He was a linguist as well. He had deep understanding of Arabic language. And every single day, he was specialized for a different topic. And the streets around his house was so full, close to the house of Abdullah ibn Abbas. Now, actually, there's a narration which says that Abdullah ibn Abbas, what would happen, there would be, there'd be these really huge gatherings. And the way that Abdullah ibn Abbas would actually approach these gatherings is he would come out of his home and he would say, right, whoever has a question about tafsir, come inside my house. So the people who had questions about his tafsir, they would come inside, ask the questions. Abdullah ibn Abbas would answer each one of them, and they would go. And then he would say, right, who has a question about fiqh? So then the people who had a question about fiqh would come inside, and he would answer all the questions, and then they would go. And so on and so forth. So he would do that with every single sort of subject area. So you can almost argue that he actually established the very first university in some sense, where people were actually learning from him, where he was the professor and he had students that were actually learning from him, which is actually quite remarkable because, to have, this is obviously we're looking at many years ago now, but we have someone who with a big, huge understanding of the deen, of the fiqh, of the of the Arabic language, so on and so forth, who's actually teaching vast majority, large groups of people. And of course, from this, we also learn that if you have knowledge of something, no matter how big or small, it is important that we also pass this knowledge on. Now, I'm not saying we have, a huge gathering outside on the streets of London, but if you have a specific, even if it's a little bit of knowledge, even if it is a little bit of something that you have learned, it is our duty to pass that on. Because you may benefit someone else even by that little speck of knowledge that we have. So let's sort of look at now the 7 traits of Abdullah ibn Abbas. We're coming to sort of the conclusion of Abdullah ibn Abbas. But let's have a look at, from all of these different stories and his search for knowledge and being the scholar of the nation, let's look at what were the traits of Abdullah ibn Abbas which made him the way he is. So he was very learning orientated. So Abdullah ibn Abbas was a keen learner, and he devoted his entire life to learning and seeking knowledge, and it was lifelong learning that he was very, invested in. And this is also a lesson for us that we should never stop learning. When someone perhaps gives you an opportunity to do a talk, like me, for instance, so I was given, alhamdulillah, this opportunity to do a talk. It's a learning opportunity for me. I'm not an expert on Abdullah ibn Abbas's life, but I went, I did my research, and now I'm presenting this to you. Okay, it doesn't mean that I'm now and likewise with a lot of the speakers that we've heard for this entire series, and perhaps before the series as well, everyone that took part and takes part, we are all learning. And so when you are given, and often I find this in the youth club as well, that when we ask our pupils or our youth group girls that, we will give them a responsibility and say, right, can you do this? And often they say, but I don't know enough about the subject. And that's a very common statement that a lot of people use, that, oh no, I'm not an expert, or no, I don't know the topic well enough. That's not the point. The point is that this is a learning opportunity, right? You learn. I even have learned about Abdullah ibn Abbas just by doing this session with you. So it is always an opportunity to learn. He also had very strong memory, and it is actually said he memorized about 1,660 hadith, many of which are recorded in Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. So he had very, very strong memory, mashallah. He had a positive attachment. So because he was in the constant company of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was almost like a special PA to the Prophet ﷺ, and they shared a mutual love for each other, and they evoked a positive emotional bonding with each other, which is actually really important with a teacher and a student, where if you are teaching somebody something, in order for them to really understand and connect with you and learn something from you, you need to establish a very good relationship with them. Often you might remember that when you were in school, or especially, for example, when I was in school, some of my best teachers were those who I had a really good relationship with. Often, especially when you've got children, and you would know this with your own kids, that they would complain about the teacher that they don't get on with, and often it's that same subject that they don't do well in either. And it's because that relationship is just not there, that bonding is not there. So when you have that special mutual love and respect for one another, that forms a positive attachment, which is what Abdullah ibn Abbas and the Prophet ﷺ had. And, to really evoke the positive emotional bonding. We know that the Abdullah ibn Abbas was very wise, and because he was born 3 years before migration to Medina, he grew up in the environment of Islam, and he grew up obviously with the company of the Prophet ﷺ as well. So he became very wise and mature beyond his years, right? He was very mature for his age because he had seen a lot from literally the moment he was born. Service mentality. Now this means that Abdullah ibn Abbas served the Prophet in many ways as a young boy. So he escorted him on journeys and expeditions, and he prayed behind him. So he saw this as an opportunity to provide a service to the Prophet ﷺ, okay? And there's two things that come from that. One is obviously if you see yourself as somebody who is always inferior instead of superior, you will always be very humble, right? If you always come in with a mentality, I'll use another teacher example, that if my pupils came in showing a lot of humility, that yes, my teacher knows more than I do, therefore I need to show them respect, they will always learn something because they know that there is somebody who is brighter than them in the room. That's the first thing. The second thing with service mentality is that because he was under the Prophet ﷺ's shadow all the time, he saw the Prophet ﷺ, in various situations and the way that he combated different situations. So that was like a direct role model for him as well. Now, in amongst all of this, while he was obviously doing all of these things as well, he wasn't only a learner, he was also a devoted worshiper, and he was a warrior as well. So, and he was able to balance his personal life goals with those of, the hereafter, with the akhirah, and obviously Islamically, spiritually. And this really shows that even though yes, we might dedicate our life to learning, but there is all this element of balance. Yes, we should always be in the mind frame of yes, we want to learn, we should learn, etc. But we also need to be taking care, for instance, of our mental health. We need to obviously make sure that we're not overexerting ourselves. We need to ensure that we are having a good family balance as well. And finally, he had incredible self-discipline. He did not get distracted from his activities, and he used to move from one to the other tirelessly. So what this essentially means is that when we have, if we're doing something, say we're learning something, but on the side we have a hobby, he would ensure that he sets out time for that, for his learning, and time for his hobby as well. And this allowed him, this mentality and this self-discipline allowed him to accomplish a lot in a period of opportunity. He was only 13 when the Prophet ﷺ passed away. And because he was only a teenager, he was able to, he was able to really understand how to balance. He understood. I mean, think about a 13-year-old. A lot of you may have 13-year-olds. I mean, nowadays, what do they like doing? They like going out with their friends and they like playing the Xbox, and maybe they'll do their homework occasionally, right? But it's this idea of self-discipline. And if you are self-disciplined and you establish that balance, then you can do things in a very limited amount of time. So, that was pretty much Abdullah ibn Abbas in a nutshell with his traits, and sort of just a very brief outline of his life story, really, which we can really learn from. And inshallah, what I'll do is we'll move on to the next Sahaba, or actually, what we'll do is I've got 3 minutes until about past. Are there any comments or any sort of comments or contributions that you guys, or even questions I can try? We have about 3 minutes. We'll do this for 3 minutes, and then we can move on to the next companion, inshallah. Anyone? Maybe 3 minutes is just a long time, I suppose.
Yeah, I don't see any messages.
No, I don't either. Feel free to type. I mean, you don't, I understand that we might be busy doing our things on the side as well, but if you want to type something, then we can, I can read it out, and that's fine as well. Maybe you'll think of something while we do the next Sahaba, inshallah. But I'll keep the chat box open in case anyone wants to mention anything, inshallah. Right, so let's move on then. So the next Sahaba that we're going to be talking about is Khalid bin Walid. Now, interesting with Khalid bin Walid. What do you know about Khalid bin Walid? I'm going to put this out to you. What do you know about Khalid bin Walid? It can be good or bad, by the way. Obviously, there are things that we know and we're going to touch upon about Khalid bin Walid. You can put it in the chat, raise your hand, unmute yourself. What do you guys know about Khalid bin Walid? And it's okay if you don't. We're going to learn. But I'm interested to know if you do, if you've read the Seerah, if there's anyone who does know anything about Khalid bin Walid already. Nobody? That's okay. Yeah, okay. So definitely Battle of Uhud from the enemy side. We're going to look at that. Cousin of the Prophet ﷺ. Yep. We're going to talk about both of these big events. Anyone else? Okay, so let's look at Khalid bin Walid in his early childhood as well. So Khalid bin Walid grew up in a very wealthy family. I mean, I can't quite explain to you how wealthy Khalid bin Walid's family was. Let me give you an example. Hopefully, maybe you'll understand. So every single year, the Quraysh, the Kuffar of Makkah, they would change the covers of the Kaaba, and that is still practiced today. During Eid al-Adha, after Hajj, they change the kiswa, the covers of the Kaaba every single year. And this is a tradition going back to the Quraysh, okay? So in 1 year, the Quraysh collectively, so all the Quraysh, the people of the Quraysh, would collectively fund the changing of the covers, okay? So they would pay for that. And in the second year, the father of Khalid bin Walid would alone pay or fund the changing of the Kaaba. So just think about like the immense wealth he has. Essentially, Khalid bin Walid's father's wealth was equal to everybody in the Quraysh collectively. Okay, so that's how wealthy he was. Absolutely so wealthy. Okay. Now, feature-wise, Khalid bin Walid was a big, muscular man. He was fair in complexion and was very, very brave. And he was known as a warrior from a very young age. So, he had the eye for strategy. He had the eye for military from a very young age. And he was actually 20 years younger than the Prophet ﷺ. Now, during the initial preaching of the Prophet ﷺ, we know that in fact, nearly all of the Quraysh did not agree with the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ because they were so engulfed in their shirk and in their idol worship. But actually, Khalid bin Walid didn't like the Prophet ﷺ, not because he denied the teaching, but because he thought the Prophet ﷺ was competing with his father. Now, let me explain what that is. So, the Khalid bin Walid's father's name was Al-Walid ibn Mughira, okay? And he actually felt, okay, it was more befitting, that he was more befitting to be a prophet than the Prophet ﷺ himself. Okay, because he used to say, well, I'm so wealthy and I'm so, I'm so well known, etc. Why didn't Allah make me the prophet? Why did he make an orphan, someone who couldn't even read or write, the prophet? Okay, and Khalid bin Walid did not, so this is why Khalid bin Walid did not accept Islam, because he thought the Prophet ﷺ was in competition with their father, right? And obviously when you're in the mind frame of competition, there is no concept of right and wrong. There's no logic, right? It's just, it's essentially, right, I'm in competition with you and I'm going to win this competition, right? All logic of right and wrong goes out the window. So that is why Khalid bin Walid actually did not like the Prophet ﷺ. Now let's fast forward now to the Battle of Uhud, a very important battle. Now Khalid bin Walid was on the side of the kuffar, of the Quraysh of Mecca, and he noticed that the Muslim archers had left their positions on Uhud. So the Prophet ﷺ had told them, that the Muslim archers, that you are to stay on this mountain no matter what happens. And what happened, the Muslims saw that, or they thought that the battle was over, they thought that the Muslims had won, they ran to the goods, they started taking them, and from behind, Khalid bin Walid noticed that, hold on a minute, these Muslim archers have left their positions, and he went round the back and basically sandwiched the Muslims between both the sides of the kuffar. Okay, and at this battle, the Muslims suffered great losses. There were lots and lots of losses at the hands of Khalid bin Walid. And from the Kuffar side, he was known as the hero of Uhud. Okay, so the Khalid bin Walid has gained amazing status at the Battle of Uhud. Okay, now again in the Battle of Trench, Khalid bin Walid was actually given the responsibility for the execution of the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, literally. So no, Sabah auntie, he was the Prophet ﷺ's cousin. Because I have the family tree, but he was the Prophet ﷺ's cousin. He was. I read that he was the Prophet's cousin. Khalid bin Walid, yes, so he was responsible for the execution of the Prophet ﷺ. So that was his one and only goal. And as he went in the Battle of Trench, for a quick summary for those of you who may not know, is that was essentially around the whole of Medina. They dug a really big trench around the perimeter, and as Khalid bin Walid tried to get through these trenches at night, he just couldn't get to the Prophet ﷺ at all. Like there was no chance. And what eventually happened was that a powerful wind inadvertently sent the Quraysh back to Makkah. So the Kuffar miraculously retreated. Obviously, we know this was a sign from Allah, and Allah sent the wind, of course, and they all retreated. So again, the Khalid bin Walid was unsuccessful, but his responsibility was to kill the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, now what's really interesting now is, obviously, fast forward again. I mean, we could be here for ages talking about Khalid bin Walid and his time during the Quraysh. But when Khalid bin Walid accepted Islam, the Prophet ﷺ was really hoping that Khalid bin Walid would come to Islam. Okay, and what happened, the way he accepted Islam was quite interesting, because he realized, look, Khalid bin Walid was a very intelligent man. He was a leader of the military, which means he knows what he's doing. He is a military genius, okay? He's very intelligent. And remember, he didn't like him because he thought the Prophet ﷺ was in competition with his father, not because he denied Islam. He was very, very smart. He knew that Islam was correct. But it was, again, his arrogance which led him not to believe. So eventually what happened was, Khalid bin Walid, he was often thinking about this mission that he was given to from the Quraysh, that he was tasked to kill the Prophet ﷺ. And in every single what he thought would be an opportunity, he failed every single time. And he said, no, this is impossible. How am I failing every single time when I'm trying to get close to the Prophet ﷺ? Like this is not like this is just out of something that I can even understand. So then he realized that, okay, maybe it is now time that I submit myself to Allah, and I pledge allegiance to the Prophet ﷺ. I know Islam is correct. I just need to do it now. So he ran into another companion, Uthman ibn Talha, and on the way to the Prophet ﷺ. And when he told him about his intention, Uthman ibn Talha agreed to escort him. And while they were both walking, they both ran into another companion, Amr ibn al-As, okay? And they all exchanged greetings, and they discussed, okay, where are you going, Khalid bin Walid, etc. And Khalid bin Walid told Amr ibn al-As that, okay, I'm going to the Prophet ﷺ. And it turned out that Amr ibn al-As was also going there, so he's like, okay, come on, we'll all go together. And they all arrived to Medina on the first day of Safar in the 8th year after Hijrah. So this is 8 years after Hijrah now. And as soon as Khalid bin Walid saw the Prophet ﷺ, he greeted the Prophet ﷺ saying, Assalamu alaikum ya Rasulullah. And the Prophet ﷺ greeted him with a bright face. And immediately Khalid bin Walid submitted to Islam and gave witness to the truth. And the Prophet ﷺ finally said, and he said, I knew that you have an open mind, and I prayed that it would lead you to safety. So then Khalid bin Walid took the oath of allegiance to him. And what's really interesting now is that Khalid bin Walid asked the Prophet ﷺ to ask for his forgiveness. And he begged him and he said, please ask Allah's forgiveness for me for all the wrongdoings I've committed to hinder men from the path of Allah. And the Prophet ﷺ replied to him and said, Islam erases all the wrongdoings committed before it. Yet Khalid bin Walid pleaded with him again and he said, please pray for me. Finally, the Prophet ﷺ supplicated and he made dua and he said, oh Allah, forgive Khalid for all the wrongdoings he committed before he embraced Islam. Although we know that when you commit to Islam or when you submit, then all your past sins have been forgiven. But Khalid bin Walid was so conscious of the fact that he had done so much wrongdoings in the name of the kuffar, in the name of the Quraysh, that he was so conscious of that, and he wanted to make sure that he was forgiven. So this just goes to show that this guilty conscience in Khalid bin Walid. Okay, it was obviously a very, what the things that he had committed, the crimes essentially that he had committed before were not a small deal. I mean, he killed some of the Prophet's own family. So think about how the Prophet might himself be feeling. Although obviously we know that the Prophet ﷺ was so overjoyed when Khalid bin Walid came to Islam. But I mean, think of it as from an emotional perspective. Obviously, Khalid bin Walid had done wrongdoings before coming to Islam. But subhanAllah, the beauty of Islam is that all the wrongdoings he committed before was erased. And Allah forgave him. Now, as a new Muslim, the Battle of Mu'tah. Okay, so this is the first battle he took part in. This was the first battle he took part in as soon as he became a Muslim. And what happened here was there were 3 leaders appointed by the Prophet ﷺ at this battle. Okay, so that was Zayd ibn Haritha, Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, and Abdullah ibn Rawaha. And the Prophet ﷺ basically appointed these 3 leaders and said, right, if Zayd bin Haritha becomes a martyr, then Ja'far ibn Abi Talib will take the lead. And if he becomes a martyr, then Abdullah ibn Rawaha becomes the lead. Now, what actually happened in this one battle, they all gained martyrdom. So they all died in this battle. And this other companion, Thabit ibn Arqam, took the flag of leadership and gave it to Khalid bin Walid. But what happened was that Khalid bin Walid, he refused it. And he felt he did not deserve it, especially also because he was a new Muslim. And Thabit ibn Arqam said to Khalid bin Walid, look, you witnessed Badr, okay? And you know the art of fighting better than me. And then he called on all the Muslims and he said, do you all agree that Khalid is the best warrior from amongst us and knows how to lead us? And all the Muslims agreed. And that is when Khalid bin Walid took the flag of the Muslim, the flag of leadership, and he accepted his role. But what I want to focus on here is the fact that, just because, number one, just because you might be a new Muslim or someone who may not have that much knowledge does not take away from the fact that you have skills and expertise in other areas. And we're going to see another example of this with Khalid bin Walid as well. Okay, and subhanallah, every single battle that he was in, he would win it. Okay, throughout his life. Even today, there are military schools in the West who study the strategies and tactics of Khalid bin Walid because his military understanding was so immense. Now, Khalid bin Walid's success comes to it comes to an end at this point because, well, this is much later now. So because he took part in so many battles during his time as a leader, people actually began to say things like Khalid is a warrior, he's the man, like they started praising him beyond perhaps what he might. Yes, he was very, very good, and yes, every single battle he was in, they won. But people started almost using that as a reason for their success. And Umar ibn al-Khattab came one day and he said, you know what, I don't like the way people are now thinking that Khalid is the big guy who wins all the wars. Essentially, when in the people's mind it was, if Khalid bin Walid isn't our leader, then we're going to lose the battle. And this mindset Umar ibn al-Khattab didn't like. So what he did was, he said, right, I want to take Khalid bin Walid out and I'm going to bring him back to Medina. And he appointed another companion as the military leader. And the reason he did that was because people started believing it was Khalid bin Walid who was making them successful rather than Allah making them successful. So again, from this we learned that we need to be mindful. Yes, okay, for example, you might have a fantastic teacher. Okay, you might be studying something, you might have a really good teacher, but it is not the teacher, it is not the reason, the teacher is not the reason why you are getting good marks. It was Allah who is giving you those good marks. Okay, you do not idolize the teacher. Do not say, oh, now that I don't have this teacher, I'm never going to pass an exam in my life. It's not the teacher, it is Allah who is giving you success. So Khalid bin Walid understood. He didn't cause a fuss about this. He was like, no, I'm the best. So he was not arrogant. He very readily accepted. He's like, fine. And again, we learned that if your leader or if somebody in the profession that you're working in or in the organization that you're working in, if they are changing your position or if they're changing your roles, it doesn't take away from the fact that you are good at it. It just means that maybe it is time for someone else to take an opportunity. A lot of the time when we switch roles or if somebody gives us another role, we take it very personally. We think, oh my goodness, I mustn't be doing a good job, or they must hate me, or they must really dislike me. That's often not the case. Okay, we never take these things personally. These things are very formal, they're not personal whatsoever. It's just to give someone an opportunity, and Khalid bin Walid is an example of that. And finally, let's have a look now at Khalid bin Walid's death. Now, Khalid bin Walid, it's so interesting that despite being on so many battlefields, Allah did not choose for Khalid bin Walid to die on the battlefield. Although it was probably very easy. He was in Badr, he was in Uhud, he was in Mu'tah, he was in so many battles. Allah could have caused Khalid bin Walid to die in one of them, right? Either as a kuffar or even as a Muslim, right? But Allah chose Khalid bin Walid's death to be on a natural, normal death on his bed. Okay? He did not die on the battlefield. And the reason with this, Khalid bin Walid was known as Saifullah. This means the sword of Allah. And the wisdom of Allah here, He chose for Khalid bin Walid to die in a battlefield because people, they might start saying things like, oh, the sword of Allah is broken. Right? People start coming up with all these interesting statements and quotes and so on and so forth. Like the people talk. So one of the things that they were worried about, or in some sense, this is Allah's divine wisdom for ensuring that Khalid bin Walid did not die on the battlefield, was so that people wouldn't start making things up, saying things like, oh, the sword is broken, or Saifullah is broken. Okay? So therefore, Khalid bin Walid died on his deathbed. And from this we can learn that death can come at any time and anywhere in any shape or any form. You would actually think that Khalid bin Walid would die on the battlefield because he was constantly in battle, but no. Allah did not write Khalid bin Walid's death at Badr nor at Mu'tah, but simply on his deathbed. And this last point that I'm going to make here is really, really fascinating because on his deathbed, Khalid bin Walid said, I was so busy on the battlefield, I was unable to learn much about the Quran, but I have no regrets. Allah has chosen me to fulfill a part of Islam. And this is a very, very profound statement that Khalid bin Walid, or actually, it's a very good learning point for us. And especially as some of us who may have, recently come into Islam, we have to remember that not every one of us will be masters in the Quran. Okay, not every one of us will be professionals in Islamic knowledge. Not every one of us will be an Abdullah ibn Abbas. Okay, we have exceptional cases. We've got one example. It's interesting because they actually contrast. On one hand, if Abdullah ibn Abbas was a scholar of the nation, and over here, Khalid bin Walid is saying, I was unable to learn much about the Quran, right? In our society, we have men and women in different disciplines, which is also a necessity in our society and community. We shouldn't underestimate the value of one another. This is what this is teaching us. That one is more contributing more or one is contributing less. Okay, no matter who you are and what skills you possess, you can serve Islam through your wealth, through your knowledge, through your skills, through anything. Even by being a homemaker, you could be serving Islam. Even by going out, working in a school or working in a law firm or working in the public health sector, anything, in the government, anything. You may serve Islam through anything. But the point is that we are serving Islam because that is our purpose and our responsibility in this society. So whatever we do, we have to be serving Islam. We shouldn't be regretting. We shouldn't be thinking, I was on the battlefield. We're not on the battlefield in this day and age, but I was working so much, so I didn't have to learn about the Quran, But what we need to remember, and actually this is something that I learned as a new mother, is that a lot of the time I would think, I'm not reading as much about Islam, or I'm not listening to lectures as much about Islam, and I'm not engaging in the Quran, especially when my son was newborn, because you're very engrossed, and especially as a new mom, you're engrossed so much about, breastfeeding and this and that. And I used to think that, and I used to tell my friends as well that, I don't feel very intellectual right now. I feel very on a spiritual low. And in our discussions, often this would come out that just because we are not doing something which is directly related to the Salah or the Quran or the Hadith or the Sunnah, doesn't mean that we are doing any less of serving Islam as being a new mother. Even, for example, us staying awake for our children, we are serving Islam in that way. We are getting reward for that because we are sacrificing our sleep for an amana, for something that Allah has gifted to us. Looking after our children is also a service to Islam. So, that doesn't mean that, okay, you don't pray. Of course, we need to fulfill our fara'id, we need to fulfill our fard. But what I'm saying is that in any walk of life, you can still serve Islam, even when you actually think you're not. So, maybe Allah has chosen you to fulfill a part of Islam through that means, through your work, through your social interactions, so on and so forth. So, there's a lot of lessons here that we can learn about knowledge from Abdullah ibn Abbas, and also about Khalid bin Walid's determination to be a warrior, but also especially this last point where maybe he didn't have time to learn about the Quran, but Allah chose him to do something else. And all of this, I was quite surprised actually when I was researching this, that all of this ties together. Everything that we have talked about today, from his successes to ensuring, there are always lessons for us to learn from these companions. And there is no point learning about all the companions that we have if you can't apply their examples in our daily life. They were human too. We are human too. They had challenges. We have challenges. Yes, they might be slightly different, but they had things that they also felt guilty about. We have things that we feel guilty about, but we learn from them. We see that, okay, they did this, so we can also do this. Yes, we don't have battlefields and we don't have hundreds and hundreds of people standing outside our doorstep, but we can maybe start small, right? Maybe we can start serving Islam in a small way, or you can start teaching the little that the little that we know to people in your own community. It doesn't need to be on such a large scale as these Sahabas. they were exceptional people, but that doesn't mean to say, that doesn't take away from what we are doing and what we are learning as well. So Jazakallah khair for, for contributing, Jazakallah khair for listening. Inshallah, keep an eye out for our next series. I'm not sure if anyone wants to elaborate on that, but inshallah, we hope that you have, benefited from this series, from my presentation today as well. And inshallah, may Allah allow us to become seekers of knowledge. May Allah allow us to become the best at what we do. May Allah allow us to, serve Islam in the little that we contribute in our families, in our societies. May Allah accept all our efforts. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. We have about 8 minutes. If there's anything